I'm doing the best I can to not, steamroll straight ahead, because it's important. Because it's important, and especially once something as big and it's hot, right? Once something as hot as racism is on the table, you want to be really careful because uh, I mean, I certainly don't like being called racist.
Nobody does,
So
bro. Yeah. And like,
yeah.
I mean,
So
don't you think part of being careful is like kind of doing the research, making sure you have the facts, like,
sure.
because, like, there's a lot going on right now. I know it's difficult. Like, we're all inundated with media. There's all kinds of media. We're doing our own content creation, so
Mhm.
we're all busy, but I worry about people making statements, generalized statements about race without understanding, how the legacy is influencing governmental policy today. Because that was one of the main mechanisms by which white supremacy enforced its rule over American society.
Mhm.
And so you would have to look there in order to see how that legacy has continued to the present day. And to me, part of being careful would be looking into that, figuring out what's going on to see if, it makes sense to create a plan for individuals on a one on one basis or a small group basis to kind of attack the problem that way. When we've been attacking the problem that way for generations, if it makes sense in this time period. I'm someone who believes that ultimately we need to change our tactics at this point in time if we really want to take advantage of the fact that we're more connected than ever as human beings. That we have more in common as human beings. I mean, it's not even comparable how much we have in common with each other than how much is distinct about us.
Mhm.
But as you've kind of noted through talking about race today, we hone in on these differences, and a lot of that is due to artificial category creation by
Mhm.
ourselves, right? So if you just think of it on that level, of course you're going to come to the conclusion that we need to simply undo what we did. However, it's not that simple, right? Because
No.
too too many systems have been built kind of on the foundation of this lie. And I mean, that's why you have to fill in bubbles for race on your little standardized tests, or, when you go to the DMV or like whatever, like this stuff still matters. There's sociologists collecting data about medical outcomes and the disparate medical outcomes that people with black doctors who are black have than when they have other doctors of other races.
Mhm.
As a teacher, I watch black students, even just this semester, a black student, a teacher wasn't doing their job and kind of and the student needed support and they weren't getting it. And the teacher's response to that was to move the student into a different class. And so, like, stuff like that,
Yeah.
just the problems are endless, they're infinite. And those problems, they can't just be, you can't fight them within yourself. Like you can fight the consequences of the problems that are internal for you, like in terms of your own thinking, like you were describing before. If you were connecting race to racism a little bit too closely, or you were not separating fantasy from reality enough, then yeah, I think that's great. That's a step that any individual who is having trouble distinguishing the false categories of race from the real consequences of racism should engage in that process. I highly recommend it. And I even suggest interrupting your thoughts like that in other contexts, in the mathematics context in which I teach. So yeah, I have no issue with that. The issue comes where that becomes a prescription for dealing with race in America. It can't. and it can't be looked at that way. I think it's extremely problematic because it's not a realistic approach to dealing with the problem as it actually exists, which is as a legacy of powerful people who are promoting these ideas knowingly, knowing what it would do to a certain extent, but to maintain power and control. So that's kind of my argument. And in fact, it could also do damage to a person who tries to believe that idea that by doing that they can kind of change things for themselves. Because ultimately, when you're confronted with racism, you're confronted with something that's typically out of your control. And that's exactly what you're confronted with. So I just want to make sure that we don't confuse all these ideas, right? Like that we're not creating a macro prescription for racism. What we're really doing is we're talking about our individual thoughts about race and just making sure that we're thinking clearly.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. None of what I was saying or espousing was was so ambitious as to say that this is what will cure racism in America. No, not of course not. There's way more that needs to be done, but I do think that it's an important thing to do. I do think that it is consequential not just on the individual level, but also the interpersonal level. So when confronted with racism, as you know, if someone is racist towards me, uh, this idea that I have about it does change the way that I receive that racism, right? It doesn't change the racism. It doesn't change what this other person is doing to me. And it doesn't necessarily change, depending on the severity of it, what must be done to counter it, right? But how I internalize it, how I feel about myself, and how I conceptualize the event itself, right? Just even the smallest thing of this person did this to me because I am blank, right? Just not having that thought, just having that thought in a different way of this person did this to me because they see me as blank. I think that is a subtle shift, but an important one. And I think it does have a lot of great downstream effects. Um, certainly for me, but also I think it would be for others. And I think, what you believe and the lens with which you're seeing the world and you see yourself can't help but reverberate. So if you believe in this way and behave according to that belief, you will have a different effect on people than you would if you believed something different. So I see it that way. But yeah, I totally agree with you about this is not the silver bullet that will destroy racism and all the systems that were created on the foundation of this concept of race and that have, been reinforced and strengthened over generations. That's not going to do it. But I do think that it's an important thing to do, at least on the street level, right? And then we can talk about the other stuff, which is more complicated.
Okay. Um, well, I do have a show where I have conversations about race. I do have conversations, in the last 2 years, I've had slightly over 100 hours of live conversations on race. But of course, that doesn't count all the ones that happen behind closed doors. So I just, when I hear you saying this effect that it has on the interpersonal level, to me, it sounds more internal. Like if you, it's about, like you even said a lot, self-belief, self this, self that. Like, yeah, of course. Like if you believe that your race means something about you, then that's a problem. Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. Yeah. If you've internalized that programming, then you have poisoned yourself. I agree.
And a lot of people have, is the thing, you know?
Yeah. I don't disagree with that. In fact, when I was watching the media that's on your website, Angel, You know, you and I have had a very similar experience, you know, about being called white. But really, I wasn't called white. I was called not black, in fact. And so I was like, you know, why do you say that? Or this person said I didn't act black specifically.
I've
They said
gotten
I
that.
didn't act black. And so I was like, well, what do you mean by that? You know, this is 6 years old. So,
That's wild.
yeah, this was 6 years old.